So in this session, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a soil moisture sensor. This is supposed to be a corrosion-proof sensor, so you can leave it in the soil and it shouldn't corrode. And it's an analog sensor, so we're going to learn how we can make its readings make sense, because it's going to give us a reading from 0 to 1023. And that number doesn't really mean anything, so what we're going to try to do is have that number mean something on how moist the soil is. And I'm going to plug it into my P1 port. My LED light is going to be in P0. I've got my other sensors in my other shield ports, so I'm starting to run out of little pins, but we still have a couple of spots left. And so let's learn how we calibrate this guy. So what I'm going to do is I am going to make a function, and I'm going to call this function calibrate soil. Okay. Now, what we're going to end up doing is I want to create a variable here, and I'm going to make this variable, and I'm going to call this calibrate soil. Okay, so that's my variable. I'm going to bring that guy down into my function, and I'm on P1, so I need to read the information that this guy is getting off of that pin. So I can do that from the pins block, and since this is an analog sensor, I'm going to analog read the pin number. Okay, so I'm going to analog read pin P1. Okay, so I'm going to get whatever it's coming off of. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a OLED. I'm going to show string. I can do show new line string. Here it doesn't matter because we're going to move everything out of the forever loop temporarily. So I'm going to say soil reading. And then I'm going to go back to OLED, and I'm going to do show number. And that variable is going to be my calibrate soil. Okay? And I'm going to pause that because otherwise it will go too fast and I won't be able to read it. Okay? So that's going to give me 2 seconds. And then I'm going to clear the screen. So it will arrive each time with an empty screen, so it just won't overwrite itself. So this is my calibrate soil function. This is going to give me a couple of important readings. It's going to give me a reading when it's dry and a reading when it's wet, and that's going to allow me to create a map of what the readings are that are relevant for my soil. So let's go find my forever loop. Now, what I want for my forever loop for right now is I'm just going to drag all of those functions out. So once they're drug out, they don't exist. And I am going to put my one calibrate soil sensor in my forever loop. So in essence, this is my program. It's these 2 blocks of code right here, my forever loop and my calibrate soil. That's it. Because there's no other functions that are called in the forever loop. Okay, and it's going to be data logging, right? But data log is not going to make much sense on the data we're collecting. All right, so let's download this. There's my microbit. It's already plugged in, so I'm going to click my download button. It's connected. Alright, let's download my file. Okay, and we'll wait for a little bit while it downloads. Alright. Excellent. Code is being downloaded as a hex file, so it's not downloading to my microbit. Let me unplug my microbit and plug it back in. Sometimes it gets a little loose on me. Okay, so I could drag and drop the file. There it goes. There's the file. Awesome. Alright, so let's go done. I'm going to download this again to my microbit. There it goes. Perfect. So I must not have had a good connection in there. Alright, so now I'm going to unplug this guy, and I am going to plug my microbit into my shield. which has got power. And now on my screen, I'm only getting my soil reading. So this is basically in dry, right? It's completely dry. So the dry reading is 635. Okay, 636. So 635. Okay, so we're gonna note that. Okay, so I'm gonna take a note here. Dry equals 635. And then what we need is what a wet reading is. So you can get a glass and get some water. Okay. And you can pour some water in. All right. And what we're going to do is just throw it in there. All right. And then we're going to look at the reading we're getting when it's wet. Okay, so my soil reading when wet is 531. 500, yep, so it's staying stable at 531. Okay, so 531. So notice when it's wet, the number is lower, which is interesting. So we have to take that into account. Okay, so now I've got this, and if I dry it off, I should go back to my readings of around 635. All right, so now I've got a sense of where this guy is going to read. All wet, 530s, all dry, in the 630s. Okay. So now I don't need my calibrate soil anymore. Okay, I'm just going to delete it, and I'm going to drag these functions back over here. Okay, so now they're back in my forever loop. But now what we want is I'm going to keep my calibrate soil function because that will be useful. And I can minimize it. I'm just going to kind of slide them over there because I'm not probably need them again unless I get another one of these capacitive soil moistures and I want to calibrate it. I'm now going to make another function. Oops, hit the wrong button there. I'm going to make another function, and this function is going to be just something simple called soil moisture. Okay. And boom, and there it is. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to actually create a variable, and I'm going to call this variable soil moisture. Okay. Now, one of the things we want to do is those two numbers that we've got, 530 and 630-ish, doesn't make any sense on what they are. I want to map them on something from 0 to 100 and use that information to be able to know if my soil is dry or wet, or if I need to worry about it. Some of it's going to be a little arbitrary and you have to fiddle with it a bit, but it gets us a good chunk of the way that we want to go. So I want to end up under my variables. I'm going to have to create a map. And so what I want is I'm going to take this set soil moisture to 0 from my variables. Okay? And notice that big 0 right there. I got to figure out what I want to map it onto. Okay? And so I'm going to end up mapping it. And now I've got to remember where my map is. Where is my map at? I always sometimes forget it. There it is. It's under pins. And I've got this map from 0 to 0, 1023, low 4. Right, so it's already ready to go for analog, since analogs read from 0 to 34. So I'm going to drag that over. And I need to get it inside that 0. There we go. Now, what am I going to map? Okay, so I'm going to map my reading that I am getting from my pin, my analog pin, at P1. Okay, that's my soil moisture reading. All right, I could have used my calibrate soil because that's the same thing that I had over here, right, in my calibrate soil, but I want to keep those things separate because I won't use my calibrate function very much. And now I got from low to high, and I'm going to map it to something low to high. Now this is where it's funny, is the low reading was actually about 635. I'm going to check that because that's why I jotted it down. Yep. And my wet reading was 531. Oops. Right, because that's the high reading. Okay, that's where it got wet. Right, so 635 was in air, 531 in water. I'm going to map that from 0 to 100. Okay, so that way I'm going to have my soil moisture reading from 0 to 100, which is going to be easier for me to wrap my head around on what that means. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I want to do something with it to know if my soil moisture is bad or good. And I'm going to do this by a series of if statements. Okay? So I'm going to move some things out of the way here because this function is going to get a little bit bigger. Okay? So I am going to go over to my logic and I'm going to create a bunch of if statements here. Actually, I'm going to probably end up with 3 if statements. Okay? Now, before I do that, I need to figure out what I think I want dry to be and what I think wet to be, because it's going to make it a little bit easier for me. So I'm going to make a couple of new variables here. I'm going to make a new variable. I'm going to call it dry soil. And I'm going to make another variable called wet soil. Okay. And so then I have to figure out what I want to set those guys to. So I'm going to go to variables because I need to have something to compare against here in my if statement, right? So I'm going to put my set wet soil here, and I'm going to also put my set dry soil reading here. Okay. I could put these in my onStart because they won't change at all. This is called a global variable. I'm going to have my wet soil be 75 and my dry soil reading is going to be 35. Okay, so that means that if it's 75 or greater or over 75, my soil's too wet. Do not turn on the water pump, right, or give me an indication that it's too wet. If it's under 35, it's dry, and if it's in between these two, everything's good. Okay, so let's set this up. So I've got my first if statement here, and I have to do a comparison. So I'm going to go back to my logic. I'm going to drag one of these inequalities over. And why I like setting up these global variables, I could just put these numbers in, but I like it because then I can go to variable and it can help me keep it straight in my head, where I want to go if my soil moisture is greater than my wet soil number. So I'm going to go back over here and find my wet soil. Okay, I want something to happen. Okay, so I'm going to have a for my basic, I want an icon to show up on my microbit. And so if it's too wet, I'm gonna pick an icon. Let's say the ghost icon. Okay, so when that shows up on my microbit, I know my soil is too wet. Okay, now I want to do it again. Okay, so I'm gonna just basically copy this if statements by clicking on it. It highlights yellow, paste it back in. Now if my soil moisture is less than my dry soil, that's the other test I want to do. Okay, where's my dry soil? Under the D's, there it is. I want, let's say, a skull icon to appear because my plant's going to likely be dead. Okay, so that gets me if it's too wet and too dry, but now I need an indicator if it's perfect. Okay, so this is where I'm going to do another if statement, and there's multiple ways to do this. This is probably the easiest way for your students to think about it, or somebody who is beginning to think about it, because it's just a series of if statements and it runs really fast. So now I'm going to do this if statement here, but this time I want it to be between two values. So I'm going to have to use one of my Boolean statements as a comparison. Okay, so I'm going to go over and I'm going to go to my variables. Actually, let's put in the Boolean statement first. So I want to go to logic, and I'm going to do an AND statement here. Boom. Okay, so now I'm going to put in my comparison across this Boolean AND. So I'm going to go back to logic, and I'm going to have one equality on one side, and I'm going to have another inequality on the other side. So that's not dissimilar than what we did before with the air temperature and humidity, where we wanted to compare both of them. And here's what I want, is I want my soil moisture, if it is greater than dry soil, okay, and if my soil moisture is less than my wet soil reading. Okay? So this means if it's basically between 35 and 75, I'm going to want a icon to appear. And let's say I want a happy face, because that means my soil is about the right setting. Okay? Alright, so you can use these variables also to set up a relay that you could control a little water pump and have the water pump run for a little bit. And we're also going to learn how we can set up a timer as well. So you could even just have a water pump set up on a timer with a relay and use the timer to turn on and off the water pump. But this is going to give us a pretty decent approach. And you might have to adjust these numbers when you look at the soil and you go, oh, that's too wet, oh, that's too dry, right? And so these numbers will take a little bit of fiddling when you get this working, but this gets us a good chunk of the way there. Now, I want to be able to see what my soil reading actually is. So now I've got this function done, and I want to go find my show data function. There's my calibrate, get data, here's my air temp, and my show function. Oh, here it is. Here's my show data. Alright, I'm going to do exactly the same thing as what I've done before. I'm going to go insert, copy that new line. I'm going to show without new line. And instead of light, this is going to say soil M equals. So for soil moisture. And then I'm going to get my reading. Okay. And that reading is going to be my soil moisture. Okay. The only thing that is a little different in using that is, notice I've got my soil moisture set up here in my function soil moisture. I easily could have done the exact same thing and moved this block over to my get data, right? And then I've got all my variables in the same get data function. Again, it doesn't matter where it is, but you do want to make sure that this soil moisture variable gets its data right before you do the if statements, right? And so we can leave it like this, or we can put it back, right? It doesn't really matter. But you also have to remember that what we need to do is to call our soil moisture function. So there's my soil moisture. Let's just pop it in there. All right, I'm going to put it above the LED strip again as well. All right. And so there's, again, there's always multiple ways to do something. All right. And now I've got a number of functions here in my forever loop. This is why we use the functions. If you had all of those functions in this one loop, right, the coding would get very messy and you'd be scrolling up and down a lot. Here I'm going side to side, which is a lot easier to be able to see all of my functions. Okay, so now let me hook up my microbit and I'm going to download it. Okay, so now let's see what I have here. I'm going to stick my microbit in, and I am going to get my soil moisture readings. It's downloaded. I've got my soil reading. It's out of the water, so I have a skull face. Okay, and I'm getting a reading of 4. Right, one thing that I did do is I put in a round statement down here for soil moisture just to get rid of all the decimals. Alright, so it makes sense. Okay. Now, if I'm going to throw it in my glass of water, it should be too wet. And I get the ghost. Okay. Now, let's see if I can get it about right in the middle. That might be a little trickier with the soil. Get a little bit of water on it to detect it. Let's see. So 77, 65. Now it should change. There we go. Now I've got a smiley face. Perfect. All right, 57. All right. So that's how you kind of calibrate your soil moisture. And you might have to calibrate it again if you start getting funny numbers, because over time, right, the leads and things will diminish in quality, and so you're likely to get changes over time. But this is going to get us pretty close to our soil moisture.